Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Choose to Challenge Why, What and How webinar hosted by the CMI London Board. My name is Natasha and I'm an events coordinator at CMI and will shortly be handing over to Sobi to begin this afternoon's event. If you have any questions during the webinar, you can ask them using the live chat box to the right of your screen, and we shall answer as many as we can during the Q&A. Today's session is being recorded and will be shared with you later today for those who book to attend. The event recording will also be available on the CMI website and the CMI YouTube channel. Now over to Sobi, Group Management Member at the CMI London Women's Hub.
Thank you, Natasha. Hello, everyone. My name is Sobi, and welcome to this webinar. So the theme for International Women's Day 2021, as most of us know already, is Choose to Challenge, which encourages everyone to get involved in the movement towards gender equality. But what's the best way to challenge inequality on a personal and organizational level? In this engaging and interactive session, TEDx speaker and author Antoinette Dale Henderson returns to CMI to share insights into the barriers to career progression for women and provide practical guidance on how we can all support one another to be more powerful at work. As part of our talk, she'll explore tools and techniques from our book, Power Up, The Smart Woman's Guide to Unleashing Her Potential, on how to assertively and respectfully choose to challenge through your verbal and non-verbal communication style. Without saying any much more, I'll hand over to Antoinette to start off the webinar.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's absolutely incredible to be here and to be joining you at the CMI to celebrate International Women's Day this year. So why are we here? As Sobi was saying, the theme of International Women's Day this year is Choose to Challenge. And there's still a huge amount that needs to be challenged. The playing field still isn't even. And I always encourage people to go back to the data, look at the evidence, look at the research, look at the facts. If you look at the most recent data when it comes to gender parity and representation, the Hampton-Alexander Review has most recently found, although female representation is doing well and FTSE 350 companies have achieved their target of 33% of female representation by 2020, that isn't so much the case at senior leadership level. Women still, in terms of representation, still only make up 29.4% in FTSE 350 companies. And of course, those are only the companies that are listed. What about all the other organizations? Look at the female representation there. And as we all know and has been covered extensively recently, COVID, the pandemic, has not been helping the situation. Some research shows that the pandemic is going to put gender equality back by at least a decade. And if you have a look at the most recent McKinsey data, what they say is women's jobs are 1.8 times more vulnerable than men's jobs as a result of the pandemic. And the majority of this is about women getting involved in unpaid care responsibilities over and above the day job, which makes it extremely challenging. And so there's still a huge amount to challenge at and organizational level. And we all know the term glass ceiling. There's still a very powerful glass ceiling that is in the way based on the data. And of course, given the impact of the pandemic, the representation, the figures, the progress that has made could potentially start sliding backwards if more and more women are stepping away from their careers because of various reasons that are related to unpaid care. And so there's very tangible reasons across all different sectors. And I want to share some data relating specifically to one industry that is particularly challenged, the tech sector. If you have a look at this data here, and this information comes from a presentation that I gave to SSP, the organization, and I'm sharing this kindly with their permission. So if you have a look at attraction when it comes to the number of women who are actually attracted to this tech sector, only 3% of women about to enter the workforce said that a career in tech was their first choice. If you have a look at visibility, only 16% of the women surveyed, and this is data from Mercer, said that they had had a career in tech suggested to them. And then when you start looking at role models within the industry, only 5% of leadership positions in the tech sector are held by women. And then, of course, we have the gender pay gap. Men in high-tech UK companies earn 25% more in average than women, and that's compared to the 18% gap that is across all sectors. And so there's a huge amount of work that still needs to be done across all different sectors, but particularly those sectors which are traditionally male dominated. So very powerful. The ceiling is still there. The glass ceiling is still there. But I also like to talk about not only the glass ceiling, which can be a barrier to gender equality, but also what I call glass bricks. And these are very powerful barriers that are inside women's heads, very strong psychological barriers based on the conditioning that girls receive as they grow up. Things like, and I want to do a virtual show of hands, and for those people to put into the chat function, raise your hand or add an emoji or just say yes if you have ever experienced this particular glass brick, the glass brick of imposter syndrome. Is this something that has received that you have ever experienced? So raise a hand if you have experienced imposter syndrome. And now continue to keep your virtual hand up. And also put in chat, have you ever experienced issues relating to confidence? These are two extremely powerful. We've got yes coming through on the chat. These are extremely powerful barriers that prevent us from fulfilling our potential. And when I was researching my book, Power Up, The Smart Woman's Guide to Unleashing Her Potential, and I'll be sharing a huge amount of insights from that book as part of my talk. When I was researching the talk, I decided to conduct some research on my own, and I asked 250 women, which of the following challenges do you experience at work? And these can all be classed as glass bricks. So a lack of confidence, we had lots of people saying that they've experienced that. Imposter syndrome, this is like the second pandemic of the 21st century. There's so much being written about imposter syndrome, that feeling that you don't quite deserve the position that you're in, or that feeling that you think someone's going to come up and tell you any minute now that you don't belong and that you need to go and be somewhere else. So imposter syndrome, a very, very tangible glass brick. There's also the barrier around being treated equally in the workplace. So if you look at this data from this 250 women, over a third felt that they had not been treated equally. Accessing opportunities at work, some real barriers to doing that, having your voice heard. And I know that CMI has done a lot of research around the data associated, comparing men and women and how they feel about getting their voice heard in the workplace. There's also the challenge around visibility. So how do people know about you? How do people appreciate the value that you bring? To what extent are you raising your profile? Very powerful glass brick that prevents us from really shining our light. that encourages us more to be self-deprecating and to hide all the brilliance that we have because we've been told from a very young age that we shouldn't show off. This is all extremely real stuff. And unless you've experienced these challenges yourself, it's very difficult for you to know what that actually feels like. And then also the challenge, 46% of the women I asked said that they had challenges around putting themselves forward in the workplace. And so these are very tangible glass bricks. And so I call it glass bricks because you can see out and you can see the potential that you have in front of you within the workplace. And people can also see through the glass bricks and they can see your potential as well. But for all of those conditioning reasons that I've just been explaining, there's some real barriers to putting yourself forward. And so this is partly where choose to challenge comes in. I think these three words are extremely powerful. Choose. What are you choosing? And how are you challenging? Because, as I said, there's still a huge amount that still needs to be challenged in the workplace. And so I would love you to post, just as I'm talking now, in the chat, what are the challenges that you are currently experiencing in your working environment? What challenges are you facing? Would you like to be able to face up to? Because I said there are some real big challenges that are occurring at an organizational level. And so let's just kind of explore them one by one, because the more we become aware of these challenges, the more we are able to start doing something about it. So simply at a recruitment level, and I know that many organizations are making great strides around making recruitment inclusive, and this is across all aspects of diversity and inclusion, but not all organizations do. And so when it comes to how a role is put out there, how a job description is articulated, what words are using, is that done in a language that conveys that position is open and available to all, or is it not? And then when it comes to sifting, who is sifting the CVs that get submitted and who is on the interview panel? I've been quite surprised with the research that I've been conducting with all the talks that I'm giving around International Women's Day at how still quite a few interview panels are predominantly made up of men. And so that's simply recruitment. But then there's also the progression and the willingness to put yourself forward, which I found in some of the data in my research. And so many of us will be aware of the research conducted by Hewlett-Packard, which found that with women need to be 100% ready to put themselves forward for a new position or to apply for a new role. So they need to feel like they are ticking all the boxes on the job description, compared to men who feel like they need to have been able to tick about 60%. So we have to feel 100% ready to apply. We feel like we need to know everything about a subject before we can speak about it. You know, that's a really powerful barrier to progression within the workplace. So other organizational barriers that require challenges as identified in the tech data, you know, if you look up and there are no women in the more senior positions, you may feel that you can't be what you can't see. And so where are the role models? Are they available? Are they visible? And then, of course, when it comes to the caring responsibilities that I talked about earlier on, one, of course, of those caring responsibilities would be around having families. And with some of the research and the interviews that I've conducted, what I found is that sometimes women will go off on maternity leave, and what happens is that their roles and their responsibilities get allocated across the team. And because there's a headcount freeze, and because recruitment isn't allowed, perhaps there isn't a maternity cover that comes in to cover that position. So the role gets covered, and so when the woman comes back, there's less of a rationale perhaps for her role. Or it may be that none of her role has actually been addressed and delivered while she's been on maternity leave. So that makes it much harder for her to make the case for part-time working. So all of these really tangible reasons that make it hard at an organizational level for women to progress. And there's many more. So, for example, women who are going through the menopause, as one example, the challenges that they're facing and the treatment that they receive. I know a number of organizations are looking into this, but this is by no means across the board. So there's some real organizational barriers that are in the way, not to mention gender pay gap reporting. But also, there's the little things. And so I'm just scrolling through the chat and looking at what are the things that you want to challenge within the workplace. There's the perception that you need to be a pushy female to fit in with senior role, and that more introverted traits are a negative. And so what I'm reading there is that there's a kind of a perception of how people should be to fulfill a particular role, rather than being open-minded around, what qualities that person needs to bring. And some real challenges around having to always needing to say yes to a certain task, to do a certain task, and not getting the return on having put themselves forward. And so there are a number of different organizational barriers that stand in the way. But in addition to that, I want to, and it's worth acknowledging and exploring the more personal challenges, the drip by drip by drip barriers that can prevent us from putting ourselves forward, that are real challenge, strong psychological and powerful challenges that stop us from fulfilling our potential as women. And as I said before, if you haven't experienced this, it's very difficult for you to understand what it feels like. And what often happens is that it's when you're in the minority. When you're in the minority, it's much harder to put yourself out there. And I'd like to share an example that I experienced just a couple of weeks ago. And bearing in mind, I do work around gender equality, I do work around impact and influence, leadership, communications. And I had decided to join an event, and it was being held out of America. And so I joined the event 5 minutes early, and it was full of people, all with American accents, all kind of, I felt like a real kind of outsider. I felt like a real other. And so a very, very strong temptation on me to keep my voice, my voice muted, and keep my camera switched off and not participate. And so there's real powerful drivers that stop us from putting ourselves forward. So there's the experience of being in the minority, but then there's also some of the subtle situations that women will experience that can conspire to hold the woman back. So those slightly inappropriate remarks that you're not quite sure whether you feel able to challenge or not. You certainly don't feel right on the receiving end of it, but you don't want to make a fuss, and so maybe you just let it go. All those situations where you're in a meeting, and I've seen this happen so often, where you've got a meeting and maybe you've got, it's a mixture of men and women, and so a question is posed 9 times out of 10, and I see this in the programs that I run as well. 9 times out of 10, it's the man who takes it upon himself to answer the question. Or we come to the Q&A, 9 times out of 10, it was a man who chooses to ask the questions. And so what that can then lead to is the subtle temptation to mansplain. And so if a man feels like his voice is getting heard, then he may feel like he needs to re-explain something that a woman has said because he perhaps is not quite sure whether it landed appropriately. So he will reiterate exactly what a woman has just said. Those subtle drip by drip experiences that we go through as women, that can subtly conspire to stop us. And of course, that's even more the case in those organizations where it's predominantly male. In those organizations where the perception is that for people to progress and develop, then it's always been men, and so it should continue to be so. And so there's some real barriers that to progression that get in the way. Despite the evidence that shows that those organizations where there is a true balance, where there's real equity, those organizations are more successful. They deliver better results. There's less attrition, greater retention, more engagement in those organizations. Because of course there's a balance of perspectives, But at a business level, if you've got an organization and it's representing the market that they're selling to, then you're going to get a much more balanced view. And so it makes absolute sense for gender equality and equity. But there are still tangible reasons and factors that need to be challenged. And I only really became aware of the need for this a few years ago. I have had a career. I spent 16 years working in healthcare communications. And in my experience, it was very, very balanced. You know, there are a lot of powerful, fantastic women who I could aspire to be. But then I remember at one point in my career, and I was probably senior management, that sort of level. And then I started to look up, and I remember thinking, well, where are all those amazing women who I used to aspire to? Where have they gone? And in many sectors, that is the case. Women get to the point where it's simply too hard. And I remember myself personally getting to a point, and this is after I had a family. I had my second child by this point. And I remember I was bound to Chicago. I was on a plane flying over to Chicago, and we were going to share some data at an international congress. And I remember this real conflict, this real kind of difficulty in trying to match up the fact that all I wanted to do as a mother was to be with my family. And at the same time, all I wanted to do in my career is do the very best for my clients. And I was on this plane, and I remember I had crippling cystitis. I felt dreadful because I'd sacrificed time on my laptop for time actually going to the loo. It had become that bad because I wanted to give so much in so many directions, and it simply became too difficult, which is when I set up my position and my organization so that I could help other people and help people progress. But when it comes to gender equality, as I say, this only really started to become a real driver for me when gender pay gap reporting started to happen. And this coincided with the Me Too movement. This is about 2 years ago now, where real extreme forms of inappropriate behavior were starting to be called out. And by this point, I have two teenage daughters, and they were becoming teenagers. And I remember having this real realization that I do not want my daughters to go through a similar experience to me. Some of those drip by drip by drip experiences that I was talking about, you know, the patronizing comments, the mansplaining, the inappropriate comments, the sexist remarks, and the real organizational barriers. I did not want that for my daughters. And so that at that point, I chose to do something about it. And it's also at this point that I worked with men and women, but a lot of women were saying to me in leadership positions, I wish I had had access to the tools and techniques that you're sharing with me. I wish I had known these earlier on in my career, which is why I chose to write Power Up. Because I realized at that point that a lot of the challenges, a lot of the inequalities are all about power. It's all about misuse of power. It's all about people feeling like they need to have power over someone. So you're either on the receiving end of it or you have it. And so I decided to dig into what is power today, and what would it be like if we were all able to truly harness the power that we have at our disposal. What would that be like? Which is why I decided at that point to start conducting some research into what power actually is. Because as I say, what I realized was that it shouldn't be that someone has the power and someone doesn't have the power, and someone, you know, can lose it and be on the receiving end of misuse of it, and someone, you know, can have the right to take it. And so I started to think about power through the ages, and I looked at power historically, and I looked at events through history. So things like the civil rights movement, the suffragette movement, those really historical moments in time where groups of people took it upon themselves to rise up and challenge the misuse of power that they were on the receiving end of. And of course, right now, we are at a point in history, I believe, where women again are rising up as a result of the murder of Sarah Everard and the huge upswelling of feeling and the way that the government is starting to respond in the UK and how this is becoming a global movement. This is a historical time where women are choosing to challenge, and so should it be. And so this is progress. This is happening all the time. And so I reflected not only on historical power, but I also looked at what data is out there, what studies have there been into power through the ages as a way of helping me to move towards how could I create some kind of methodology to help women to power up their own potential. And so what I found was that the first piece of data, the first piece of research that, and I remember I used to share this in the leadership development programs that I used to run, was some research from French and Raven. And it's not that recent, is it? It's 1959 to 1965. They were looking at 6 different forms of power. And so these are step by step. You've got coercive, and that's power that is exerted through force. And of course, you may think, actually, who wants to use that kind of power? But if you think of things like if people, if they break the speed limit, there has to be some kind of consequence that is imposed through force that stops them from doing it again. But that only is a very narrow form of power. You've got reward power. And an example of that is the bonus structure, for example. If you do well, then you will be rewarded. Then you've got legitimate power, and that's power through a hierarchy. So if you have a particular level within an organization, then you have the right to exert your power. Not that I think that is necessarily appropriate or relevant so much in today's working environment. There's the referent power, which is where power is earned. So for people who have developed their power because people want to be led by them, people want to follow them. You've got expert power, and that's about subject matter expertise. And then you've got informational power, which is about if you have information and if you have access to information, then you have power. So I thought, having looked at this, this thinking around power, that it felt quite constricting. And so I then went on to look at, well, what else has come out? And Joseph Nye in the late 1980s, equally not particularly recent, looked at the difference between hard and soft power. This is more about political power. So those countries who exert their power through force and through dominance. So that's more about hard power. And then the soft power, the softer political power, is around exerting your power through influence. So a much softer way of communicating and bringing people around to your way of thinking. And so it was Joseph Nye's thinking around hard and soft power which inspired me to think about, well, how does that relate to power now and to the way that people relate to one another in today's world? And of course, there's been quite a lot of work and talking around soft powers which can traditionally be more associated with women. So things like being able to influence, having emotional intelligence, empathy, charisma. Some of those softer powers are traditionally associated with women. And then there's the harder powers, things like strength and force and assertiveness, traditionally associated with men. And I remember thinking, well, why should that be the case? And why actually should it be that the softer powers are almost seen as less valuable and less important? And I remember talking about emotional intelligence in a leadership development program, which coincidentally was 100% men. And I remember introducing the theme of emotional intelligence and almost seeing people's eyes glazing over because they didn't feel like emotional intelligence was relevant to them. Whereas I believe that in today's world, the most powerful managers, leaders, the most effective people are those people who have developed that power of emotional intelligence. And so where does that come in? What is that all about? Well, emotional intelligence is the ability to flex and choose your response to whatever situation you find yourself in, to be able to be in command of your own emotions and your own reactions and be able to channel them so that you can choose to challenge as and when you need to. And so this is about being able to tap into a whole range, a whole spectrum of different types of powers, which I realize exist, from the soft glow of influence and empathy and listening and that quiet power, all the way up to the harder, stronger, more directive and more assertive power that we absolutely need to learn to tap into when we challenge. But of course, there's a whole load of different ways in which we can challenge. And so, having done this research and thought about where does power come in? What is the new power paradigm for today's world? What I decided to do is to create a model and to write the book, exploring what I see as power in today's world. And so I'm going to take you through the Power Up model, which I created, which is encapsulated in the book Power Up. And then we're going to look at specifically how to exert the power of assertiveness and also how specifically to choose to challenge. And so, having conducted my research into what power is, I created this Power Up model, which is based around a 6-point star, and it taps into and totally flips on the head the belief that you can either have power or not have it, that you're either on the receiving end of it or not. It's so much more sophisticated than that. And so here are the 6 different forms of power, and I'd encourage you to look at developing each of these for you to be able to fulfill your potential at work and to be able to choose to challenge. The first source of power is the power of intuition. And traditionally, I mean, you've heard of female intuition. Traditionally, intuition is a power that women tend to tap into more naturally than men. That is the traditional belief. However, of course, we can all do it. Intuition ultimately is our lived experience stored in our subconscious mind. And so being able to tap into your power of intuition is about finding ways to tap into your lived experiences and tune into your intuitive, your subconscious mind. Some of the world's most influential and successful leaders, people like Oprah Winfrey, Steve Jobs, Richard Branson, they tap into the power of intuition to make decisions, more so than any other thinking process. So this is the first one, the power of intuition. The second power source is knowledge. And you'll all have heard of the phrase, it's not what you know, it's not who you know, it's what you know. That comes across actually when we're talking about the power of relationships. But when it comes to the power of knowledge, this is the phrase, knowledge is power. And this is about not only the experience that you've developed over time, but also your skills and your capabilities and your qualifications. That absolutely comes into it. But it's also about your knowledge of the organization that you work in, your knowledge of the sector that you're operating in, and your ability to evidence that as a way of increasing your visibility. I use the analogy of a diamond because you could be the most incredible subject matter expert at what you do. But unless people know about it, unless people can see it, you may as well be a rock underneath the surface of the earth. And so your knowledge, it's not only about having it, but it's how do you evidence it to others? How do you enable it to shine? The next power source is the power of resilience. And we have all had to really tap into the power of resilience, especially over this past year. And so this is about your ability to bounce back from challenging situations, your ability to handle and navigate change. Every single one of you in this audience will be going through monumental organizational change within your sector. You'll also be going through personal change throughout this past year. The challenge of remote working and also the future around going back to work and what that's going to look like, what that's going to feel like, and having to navigate and juggle all the multiple responsibilities that particularly women are facing right now. The power of resilience is one that we're going to need to continue drawing on as we progress through and beyond the pandemic. The power of magnetism. This is your power to attract. This is about drawing attention to yourself. This is about increasing your visibility. This is about raising your profile. As I said before, if people don't know about you, if you don't have a personal impact and you don't know how to communicate in an influencing way, then your message won't get heard. So magnetism is about how do you become more noticeable? How do you stand out from the crowd? And how do you do that? Through being yourself. The power of relationships, as I mentioned before, it's not necessarily what you know from the knowledge side of it, but it's about who you know, the power of relationships. And women, in fact, tend to be better at nurturing relationships, reaching out, having conversations, supporting one another, building that network. Women tend to naturally be better at doing that than men. However, networking, building relationships, really sort of tapping into, the people that you know, both within your organizations and externally, that can be one of the things that drops off the list of priorities, particularly when we're busy and we're juggling huge amounts of responsibilities. So I would encourage you to really pay attention to the power of relationships, because again, this will enable you to continue to fulfill your potential in a working environment. The final power source is the power of assertiveness. And this is about finding your voice. This is about articulating what you want and making sure you get it. This is absolutely linked to choosing to challenge. So if you want to choose to challenge, this is about how do you use your assertive voice? How do you get your message across when you are on the receiving end of, or if you notice some of those challenges, the big organizational challenges around you, but also the subtle drip by drip by drip experiences that you are going through on a daily basis. And I know that you are. How do you use your assertive voice to choose to challenge? And so what we're going to move on to now is to look at exactly that. And so if we break it down, firstly, what are you choosing? And firstly, if you are really clear on what you want, if you're very clear on your purpose, which was at the heart of the Power Up model, if you're clear on your purpose and you know what you want, it's going to be much easier for you to identify what needs to be challenged and what needs to be called out. So start by getting really clear on what you want, what you are choosing. Then you can think about what you're challenging. Okay, there's a number of different things here. And so you could be challenging absolutely everything. You could be calling out and fighting every single battle. And if you do, power up to you. However, you could end up getting absolutely beaten down and exhausted by it. And so this is about choosing which of the battles that you want to walk into and step up to and fight, and which are the battles that you want to leave to other people. Ultimately, we are all in this together, and so we all need to be challenging in our own ways. So choose what you challenge, but also choose when you challenge. And so if you've had a situation where you've been triggered, something's happened and it's knocked you off course, and you're feeling absolutely incensed, and I certainly have had moments in my life where I have had that feeling of, I'm about to explode. Think about in that moment whether that's the most appropriate time for you to challenge, and if you're going to be able to do so using your emotional intelligence, or whether actually it would be better for you to leave it 24 hours, cool down, think rationally, use your knowledge and come back and challenge next time. So think about what you're challenging, and think about when you're challenging, and then finally, let's look at how you can challenge. And I've developed a handy acronym, a model which sums up how you might want to choose to challenge, and it's called IDEA. Firstly, I stands for immediacy. And so if there's something, as I was describing before, that you've had an allergic reaction to, it may be that if you feel like you're going to flip your lid, lose it, do or say something that you will regret later, then perhaps you need to draw back. However, if you have had an allergic reaction, this ultimately is your intuitive mind telling you that this is something that you need to step up to. And so the immediacy of dealing with it can be extremely powerful. So I stands for immediacy. The D of IDEA stands for direct. And I've been reading in relation to Choose to Challenge, I've been reading around and looking into the work by Kim Scott, which is called Radical Candor. And what she talks about is to care personally, but challenge directly. And so this is where the D of IDEA comes from. So what does that mean? Well, the care personally is to know, to remember that most people don't act inappropriately because they're evil people. You know, that they are doing and thinking the best that they can within the world that they are in. They just have a very narrow perspective. And so first of all, think about, how can you bring them round? What's the best way for you to bring them round to your way of thinking? And so to challenge directly, this is about being specific about what they did. And so to step in and be direct. So for example, I'd like to call out what was said just then. I'd like to challenge the point that was just made. So you're being direct. The E of IDEA, it stands for example. So you provide an example, you're explicit about what it is that they've done or what it is that they've said. This is either at an organizational or an interpersonal level that you'd like to challenge. Because often people have no idea that what they've done is inappropriate. And so you're highlighting what they've done and what they've said so that they understand why you felt it was inappropriate. So that's example. And then the A in the IDEA model stands for alternative. And this is about being specific again, being direct and specific about what you'd like them to do instead. And so, for example, the way that this might sound from the top is, I'd like to pause a minute and call out what was just said. When you referred to us group of women as girls, I found it quite demeaning and disrespectful. What I'd like to see instead is that you refer to us as colleagues and as women in our own right. So you can see you're being immediate, you're being direct, you're giving the example, but you're also providing the alternative. So IDEA will help you practically choose to challenge. And so I'd like to finish by looking at the final point around male allyship. And this is something that is being discussed a huge amount currently in the workplace. How can men, and many men are asking this question, how can I support my female colleagues in this space around Choose to Challenge? What can you do? And so firstly, the first point is for men, to start to increase your awareness and your empathy of what it must feel like to be on the receiving end of these big organizational challenges, but also some of these drip by drip by drip personal experiences that all women face on a daily basis. And so increase your awareness and your empathy of that. The second point is curiosity over judgment. And so what this is about is, if you notice inappropriate behavior, then to start by being curious where that behavior is coming from. And so it would be very easy to go in and judge and criticize and make the other person wrong and be very strong and directive in that sense. But if you're wanting to bring someone around and help raise their awareness of what gender equality actually looks like and sounds like and feels like, then ultimately, if you dig your heels in, then they're going to dig their heels in as well. So curiosity is more about trying to understand where that behavior is coming from and what needs to happen to bring it round. So when it comes to men, once again, if you have women in your team and you want to help them develop and progress and overcome some of these tangible challenges that we've been talking about, this is about how do you proactively encourage. And so an example of that might be, how do you bring someone on who, if you notice that they are not having an equal voice at the table, if you notice that they are finding it challenging to get their voice heard, to proactively bring them into the discussion, to proactively put themselves forward for opportunities that they might be hesitating to do, to proactively help them develop and progress. But this isn't about rescuing, okay? Coach, don't rescue. So coaching is about how do you help a woman find her own way? How do you help her find her own way through and identify her own career progression, find her own answers? Because if you're going in and rescuing and telling her what to do, then ultimately that boils down to mansplaining. Another really practical technique that I recommend, and this goes for all aspects of diversity and inclusion, is, and it will help with one of the points that I noticed in chat earlier on around the difference between people who are more on the introverted end of the spectrum and those who are more on the extroverted end. If you appoint an equal voice ambassador, so if you identify one person whose job it is to make sure that everyone gets an equal voice and everyone's voices are heard, that will pay dividends when it comes to ensuring that you get a shared perspective. Choosing to challenge it makes business sense. It's the right thing to do. And ultimately, it's about understanding that right now it is extremely challenging still to be a woman in the working world. It may not be for every woman. She may have got there, fought her battles, learned and achieved, and she may have forgotten or not be aware of some of the challenges that many, many, many women are facing. And so this is about being emotionally intelligent. Use that superpower of the 21st century to truly understand where women are coming from and to support them. I'd like to take us to a point in the future where we don't need International Women's Day to call out inequality. We don't need it to challenge, but that instead what we have International Women's Day for is to celebrate the absolutely incredible amazingness of what women bring, so that we can all support one another in the workplace and that we can all fulfill our potential and be successful in the most powerful way. I'd like to hand back to Sobi. I know that there's been a number of different comments and questions that have come through on chat. So yeah, over to the Q&A session.
Thanks, Antoinette. That was great. So we've got a few questions and I'll read them out to you one by one. So there's a question where someone is asking, does choosing to challenge means being bossy or a leader?
Yeah, so this is a classic one that comes up, is that the perception can be that if a woman is being assertive, she gets branded bossy and she gets given those negative labels. And so that clearly isn't fair. That absolutely isn't fair. And so, you know, part of the challenge here is to call out when that is happening. But also, if I put myself in the shoes of the woman, ultimately, what is it that you're calling out? What is it that you are wanting and needing to be assertive about? And then thinking, well, if ultimately what you're wanting to do is bring about behavioral change, bring about organizational change, then what is going to be the most effective way of doing it? How are you going to influence that person to bring them round? And so what you can then think about is the combination of the words that you're using, but also the non-verbal way in which that you are expressing them. And so if you're using strong and powerful words, and that, absolutely is a way of challenging. But if you're doing it in a loud and shouty and overbearing way, then your message is not going to get heard and it's not going to land. And so it's about tempering the nonverbal delivery of the words so that they get heard. But at the same time, if you want to be heard, then it's about how do you learn how to power up your communication style from a non-verbal perspective so that it does land. So it's the balance.
Thanks, Antoinette. So in line with that question, there's another question that says that there is a perception that you need to be a pushy female to fit in with senior role, and that more introverted traits are negative. How can you power up as an introvert?
Yeah, great question. And there is that perception. And I have observed that in the most forward-thinking organizations, in the most successful organizations, they are taking steps to move beyond that narrow thinking. And they're looking at all aspects of diversity and inclusion and taking steps to ensure that everyone's voices are heard. And so when it comes to the extreme of introversion and extroversion, those organizations will be taking steps to ensure that even those people who are on the quieter end of the spectrum get their voice heard. And so partly, if that isn't the case in the organization that you're in, what is it that you can do to do something about it? How can you start to subtly influence that change? If you're a manager or a leader yourself, how can you be proactively demonstrating those behaviors that you would like to see as a way of influencing the people around you? Perhaps how can you bring that discussion to people in HR, people in L&D, and encouraging them to be more open-minded about the whole spectrum of different ways in which people express themselves? And so that's in relation to organizational development and organizational change. Choose to be in the organizations that are forward-thinking. But then from the perspective, if you yourself are and see yourself more on the introverted side of the spectrum, then part of what this is about is finding ways of getting your voice heard. And sometimes we feel like we need to have a huge amount of pressure to be the loudest voice in the room, to shine our light more brightly. And I don't actually think that's the case. I think sometimes people who are on the more extrovert end of the spectrum, they could be too much. They can eclipse other people. So know that your way is just as valuable as any other person's way. But also take some steps to prepare, to think about what messages you want to be communicating in a meeting or in a one-to-one. Prepare in advance, because that will help you to be more articulate in that situation. And also remember that introverted people, you can tell I'm really passionate about this, introverted people tend to be better at asking questions and really listening to the answers. And that is an example of real soft power, that emotional intelligence, which is, I believe, almost more valuable in the workplace today than other forms of power that are louder.
Thanks, Antoinette. So another question we have here says, how can I coach men to choose to challenge?
Okay, so this comes back to the care personally and challenge directly. And so most men, I like to believe this, most men want to do the right thing, but many men don't quite know how. They don't know what to say. They don't know how to say it. So they don't say anything. And some men are inappropriate. And so how do you coach men? I think it's about retaining that emotional intelligence and using the evidence. So with the idea model, be direct, use the examples of exactly what they're doing and what they're saying that is inappropriate. Be really specific on the examples, but then give them an alternative to do instead. So that would be my recommendation around how to coach men to how to choose to challenge them.
Thanks, Antoinette. So we've got another question that says, or rather, the person is asking, do you think the struggle men have with relationships and emotional intelligence is linked to the idea of a man's man and toxic masculinity? How can we challenge that as women?
I think that I think it's really interesting. First of all, that we're looking at gender equality and where we're focusing on the challenges that men are facing right now. I think that's really interesting. I remember my book launch last January. There were 100 women in the room and 3 men: the cameraman, my husband, and a friend. And it was fascinating. The Q&A session at the end, before we knew it, we were talking about how can we make things better for men. Fascinating, because that's part of our conditioning. We want everyone to be okay. We want to look after everyone. And that is just such a beautiful female quality. And yes, this is an extremely challenging time for men. If you have a look at the suicide rates, you look at the incidence of mental health problems, mental illness, there's a huge pressure on men. There's a real identity challenge that men are facing right now. And so there's this maelstrom of different things. There's a whole range of different challenges that men are facing. And so it's really dangerous, I think, to put anyone into boxes. That there is toxic masculinity, but that there's a real crisis when it comes to men's mental health as well. Women also, are experiencing challenges around safety, simply walking out in the street. And so everyone is fighting different battles. And so I think my belief is that it's about how we can all support one another, how we can all be more empathetic of one another and learn from one another so that we can create a more inclusive environment. And it starts with the environment that we are in. And so we've got a huge network of women simply, and men in this audience. If every single one of us were to choose to challenge what we perceive as inequalities and choose to reach out and support one another as well, imagine the change that simply we would make as a group of people.
Thanks, Antoinette. So another question is asking, can you elaborate on building confidence? There have been lots of comments suggesting this is an area for development in the audience. So if you could please elaborate on that, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So that was when I asked you all to put your hands up, there was imposter syndrome. And I also asked you to put your virtual hand up if you've experienced challenges around confidence. And this is an extremely powerful glass brick that is in many women's way. The point about confidence is there's a real myth that we need to go out and find it. We need to go and get it. We need to learn or do or be something else to be more confident. The thing is that no one is inherently confident. No one is confident all the time. I'm certainly not confident all the time. Confidence is more about actually, if you come back to yourself and if you spend time thinking about the value that you bring, the knowledge that you have, how amazingly resilient you are, the intuition that you have at your disposal, if you come back to all those sources of power that I talked about in the Power Up model, if you come back to yourself and what you already have, that will immediately start to build and grow your inner confidence. So you don't have to go and get it from outside. It's already there within you. And so confidence is about tapping into what you already have. And it's also about how do you evidence it to yourself and evidence it to other people. And so I would recommend that to be able to evidence it, you do get better and really pay attention to your communication style. How you articulate it, how you present it, how you communicate it, how do you talk about your successes? Because the better you get at communicating why you're amazing, the more you'll realize it and the more other people will realize it too. So it's about starting with yourself, tapping into all those amazing power sources that you have, but also working on expressing yourself confidently. And that is much more simple than you think. It's absolutely learnable. It's absolutely doable. Whether you're introvert, extrovert, whatever you are, everyone can learn to express themselves more confidently by following simple tools and techniques.
Thank you. We've got time for one more question. I think you like this one, Antoinette. So there's a question for you asking, what was your Choose to Challenge pledge this year, Antoinette?
My Choose to Challenge pledge was to bring it to these talks. I've been privileged enough to deliver a number of different Choose to Challenge talks. And so what I wanted to do was to really bring the evidence and really help people who perhaps don't understand what it's like being on the receiving end of some of this stuff, really share those stories and those experiences and those examples to open people's eyes up to how real this is. You know, I often hear, why do we need International Women's Day? There's some real tangible reasons, both evidential, both qualitative and quantitative, that we can all share. So that's been my challenge, is to bring it, but also to bring some really practical techniques and ideas and inspiration to women so that we can all stand up and feel powerful together.
Thank you very much. I'm sure I can attest with others that you've actually brought it here. So I'm going to hand over to Natasha, who's going to take over from here. Over to you, Natasha.
Thank you very much. That is it for this afternoon's session. Thank you to everyone who joined us, and thank you to Sobi and Antoinette for your insights and expertise. Antoinette has also kindly offered a discount on her latest book, Power Up, which we'll be sharing in our follow-up email as well for anyone interested. If you are a member of CMI, you can log into Management Direct using the link in the live chat, and you can find a wide range of exclusive and practical development resources and much more. And if you're not yet a member, you can join our community via the link that's also in the live chat to gain full access to our Management Direct portal. You can also sign up to the free CMI newsletter for the latest trends and tips for managers and leaders. So thank you again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.